what if the root of all human suffering, like all the misery, the corruption, the pain, what if it wasn't greed?
Right, like what if it wasn't corrupt politics or, a broken economic system?
Exactly. Or even some inherent dark flaw in human nature. What if it was actually the one institution you trust the most? Your family.
I mean, that is an incredibly explosive premise.
Mm,
To just, point right at the bedrock of how human beings organize themselves and call it the source of our collective misery.
it really is.
Mm,
And that is exactly what we are putting under the microscope today. Welcome to the deep dive.
glad to be here.
So for you listening, today we are looking at a highly provocative, deeply unconventional text. It's from 2007 by an author named Sue Saffing, and it's titled The Program of Suffering, Disbanding the Family Unit.
Quite a title.
Yeah, no kidding.
Yeah.
And just to be crystal clear right up front, we aren't endorsing these ideas.
Yeah.
We aren't here to judge them either. So
Absolutely not.
this text goes after the absolute foundation of society. Our only job today is purely to dismantle the author's logic, piece by piece, so you can evaluate this fascinating and honestly radical argument for yourself.
Precisely. We are here to reverse engineer the architecture of this argument, because to understand how an author can logically conclude that the family unit must be, well, eradicated, we have to follow their diagnostic process.
Right.
The text claims to identify the underlying illness of society, isolate the specific virus causing it, and then it proposes a rather drastic cure.
To understand why this author thinks the family is a virus, we first have to look at why they think every other cure in human history has failed. Because the text does not start small.
No, it definitely doesn't.
It opens by invoking three of the most monumental figures in human history.
Yeah.
We're talking Buddha Sakyamuni, Jesus Christ, and Karl Marx.
Yes, the author sets a massive historical stage right out of the gate. The text notes that, the Buddha sought to address human suffering through spiritual enlightenment and detachment.
Right.
And Jesus Christ offered divine salvation to save humanity from its inherent pain.
And then you have Karl Marx.
Exactly, who proposed a radical restructuring of economics and class to liberate humanity from oppression.
Okay, let's unpack this,
Yeah.
because it is an incredibly bold move for an author to put their own theory right next to Buddha, Jesus, and Marx.
A huge swing, yeah.
The text essentially claims that the teachings of these figures and like the history of all utopian societal experiments have completely failed to eradicate human misery. What kind of diagnostic tool is the author using that these historical figures supposedly missed?
Well, the author argues that all of those movements failed because they fundamentally misdiagnosed the disease. They were treating the symptoms of human suffering rather than the root cause.
So they're missing the actual infection.
Exactly. According to the text, whether you are talking about spiritual salvation or a communist revolution, these leaders built their solutions on top of the existing foundational structure of society.
They just accepted the family unit as a constant.
Right. An immovable reality. So, to find the actual disease, the text argues, we have to stop looking at human history through the lens of sociology or economics and start looking at it through the lens of biology.
So shifting from history to biology, how does that change the diagnosis?
The author introduces a strict biological framework. They say we must view human society not as a collection of laws or markets, but as a single living organism. And in any living organism, what is the most fundamental microscopic building block?
It's the cell.
It is the cell.
Think about it like going to the hospital for a blood test, right?
Mhm.
The doctor doesn't just look at your whole body. They look at your microscopic cells to find the illness. The author is basically doing a societal blood test and claiming the family unit is the basic cell.
That's a great analogy, yes.
Yeah.
The author states it as a biological inevitability. When a single cell within a body carries a pathogen or a virus, the entire organism will inevitably become diseased.
Wow.
You just cannot have a healthy body made up of infected cells.
Which fundamentally shifts the blame for society's problems. I mean, instead of pointing the finger at macro institutions like, say, a corrupt government or unregulated capitalism or, historical grievances, the author is pointing the finger directly at the living room.
Right at the kitchen table.
Yeah. They're claiming that the basic cell of human society is testing positive for a deadly virus.
What's fascinating here is how the author uses this biological framing to completely reorient where we look for the source of human misery. If the family is the infected cell and society is sick as a result, We don't need to overanalyze global supply chains or political regimes.
Right, we just need to look at ourselves.
Exactly. We only need to examine the psychological mechanics of the family unit.
Which brings us to the most uncomfortable and arguably the most perceptive part of the author's diagnosis. Because if we accept this premise that the family is the cellular building block, we have to look at how this supposed virus actually functions in the real world.
Which is hard for a lot of people to hear.
Oh, absolutely. For most of you listening, your family is your sanctuary. It's the one place you go to escape the sickness of the world, not the cause of it. So, how does the text explain the mechanism of this virus?
Well, the author asks us to trace societal ills back to their absolute psychological source. Let's take the example of corruption or bribery or corporate greed.
Okay.
When a politician takes a bribe or an executive embezzles funds, we have to ask why they are doing it. The text argues that it is almost never out of pure cartoonish malice.
Right, it's rarely a comic book villain trying to destroy the world just for fun.
No, exactly.
The author's core insight is that human greed isn't usually driven by hate. It is actually driven by love. Our desire to protect our specific in-group becomes the weapon we use against the out-group.
Spot on. The text claims the core motivation usually revolves around providing for parents, securing a better future for a spouse, and most importantly, elevating one's children.
It's about bringing honor and safety to that specific family unit. Here's where it gets really interesting, though, because the text drills down into the psychology of keeping up appearances. It points out that people are deeply terrified of being looked down upon.
Oh yeah, social pressure is huge.
And not necessarily by strangers, right? But by the people they know. Their peers, their neighbors, their extended relatives. It's like a societal arms race. But instead of nuclear weapons, the weapons are food, better housing, nicer cars, and elite education for the kids.
The pressure of familiar faces is immense. The text argues that to prevent their loved ones from experiencing the indignity of being lesser than, people feel this crushing compulsion to ensure their family's standard of living is relentlessly competitive.
We spend our entire lives frantically chasing fame and fortune, and it all fundamentally funnels back into the family.
Right.
But if your standard salary isn't enough to win that psychological arms race, what happens? The author suggests that is the exact moment the virus activates.
That's the trigger.
You justify breaking the rules, you justify taking the bribe, or cutting corners at work because you are doing it for the noble cause of providing for your family.
And the text asks the reader to imagine a theoretical reality where people simply had no family. If you had no parents to honor, no spouse to protect, no children to elevate above the rest of society, would you still lead such a frantic, morally compromised life chasing excess wealth?
And the author says no.
The author concludes definitively, certainly not.
But the source material takes us a step further, and this is what really caught my attention. It redefines what the true casualties of this family-driven competition actually are.
Yes, this is a crucial pivot in the text's logic. The author acknowledges that this relentless family-centric consumption leads directly to the destruction of the ecosystem.
Depletion of natural resources, pollution, all that.
Right. But surprisingly, the text explicitly states that environmental destruction is not the main issue.
Which is a wild stance to take.
Yeah.
I mean, given how existential the climate crisis is, if the destruction of the planet isn't the primary tragedy here, what is?
The primary damage, according to the author, is the profound mental and emotional suffering caused by constant social comparison. The text argues that this pressure cooker of familial expectation leads to crime. And importantly, it broadens the definition of crime far beyond just violations of the law.
What do they consider a crime then?
The author specifically calls out the mental torment and emotional abuse that arise when people inevitably fail to keep their promises to one another in this hyper-competitive environment.
Oh, wow. So the mechanism works like this. The family unit creates an insatiable demand for resources and status. Because resources are finite, I have to compete with you to get them for my kids.
Exactly. It's a zero-sum game in a way.
And in order to win that competition, I inevitably have to break promises to my community, betray my friends, or compromise my integrity. And that betrayal causes a ripple effect of emotional abuse and mental torment across all of society.
That is the structural argument. Thousands of years of human history, the text claims, prove that the family operates exactly like a virus. It forces the host to destroy its surroundings to replicate its own status.
Wait, let me push back on this, though, because this raises a massive question about accountability and, free will. If all this pain, this corruption, and this emotional destruction stems directly from the family structure, Who is ultimately to blame?
That's the big question.
Is it the greedy parents? Is it society for setting up the competition?
The author's answer introduces a new paradigm here. They introduce the concept of the program.
The program.
Yes. The text states that the virus is actually the result of a hard-coded program. The family itself is an unyielding, rigid software program running in the background of humanity.
Okay, so if the family is an operating system, then what the author is saying is that corruption and greed aren't glitches in human nature.
No, they're features.
Features working exactly as programmed. The software literally forces you to hoard resources for your specific user group.
Precisely. And the text argues that once a human being enters this program, once they marry and have children, it does not matter how morally upright or outstanding they are as an individual.
They're trapped.
The program will execute. They will be infected by its viral demands to compete and consume.
The source quotes that famous proverb to back this up, right? Every family has its own difficult scripture to recite,
Yes, exactly.
which means behind closed doors, every family has its hidden struggles, its resentments, its secret pains. And the author argues that the scripture is difficult precisely because the operating system itself is fundamentally flawed.
It's corrupted software.
But wait, so the author's completely absolving individuals of guilt. If a parent ruins other people's lives to secure an inheritance for their kids, the text is suggesting it's not actually the parent's fault, or even society's fault. It's just the program's fault.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, you can see how this framework fundamentally changes how we view human conflict. The text is very explicit about this absolution. Yes. The conflicts within a family and the resulting conflicts in the broader society are not viewed as the moral failings of any individual. It is the inescapable architecture of the family program itself that forces good people into destructive behaviors.
That is a staggering, almost terrifying way to view human agency. It basically claims we're all running corrupted software, we have no control over the output, and until we uninstall the operating system, society is doomed to crash over and over again.
And the text does not mince words in its ultimate conclusion regarding this software. It states definitively that as long as families do not disband, humanity's suffering will never end.
So what does this all mean? If the family is a diseased program, a virus-carrying cell that causes all our misery and completely strips us of our moral agency, the logical conclusion is that we have to delete it, right?
You have to uninstall it, yes.
We have to disman the family unit. But how on earth does a society actually execute that without resorting to, like, totalitarianism? You can't just forcefully rip families apart.
The author is actually quite grounded about the logistics of this, surprisingly. Oh, really?
Yeah. The text openly admits that expecting people to willingly disband their existing families is entirely unimaginable. It's unrealistic.
Right, because you can't just mandate that people walk away from the spouses they love and the children they've raised. Human emotion just doesn't work that way.
The text compares a forced disbandment to expecting people to willingly hand over all their personal property to strangers on the street. Or, to return to our medical analogy, it compares it to trying to perform complex, open-heart surgery on yourself.
Ouch. Yeah, that's not happening.
Right. People simply cannot dismantle their own familial bonds. The emotional and structural roots are just too deep.
Okay, so if breaking up existing families is practically off the table, what is the actual way out that this author is proposing?
The text proposes a singular, highly specific solution: attrition. A global, generational marriage strike.
A marriage strike.
Yes.
Just letting the clock run out on the institution. Exactly. The mechanics are simple, even if the execution is monumental. The rule is, those who are not yet married must never get married. And those who are currently divorced must never remarry.
So you just don't create new cells.
Right. You don't perform the violent surgery of breaking up existing cells. You simply stop the organism from generating new ones. You let the institution phase itself out naturally as the current generations age out of it.
It's a massive thought experiment. You just stop clicking install on the program, let the current operating system run its course until the hardware degrades, and then the family unit just slowly, quietly fades into the history books.
But as the text itself readily acknowledges, phasing out marriage sounds clean and peaceful in theory. In practice, however, it creates a catastrophic logistical vacuum for the entire human race.
Calling it a vacuum is the understatement of the century. When I was reading this part of the source material, I was just checking off the immediate, glaring existential crises this creates.
There are a few.
Just a few. If nobody gets married, and the family unit dissolves entirely, How do we handle basic human reproduction and sexual relations? Do we still have children?
And if we do have children, who raises them?
Exactly. Who is legally and morally responsible for educating them if the concept of parents no longer exists?
Not to mention the infrastructure required for the other end of life. How does a society manage aging, illness, and death without the built-in support system of family caretaker?
Right. Who is going to take care of you when you are 85 years old? And zooming out even further, how does a global economy even function? Entire industries like real estate, insurance, consumer goods, they're built entirely around the consumption habits of the nuclear family.
It's true.
It's like pulling the bottom block out of a Jenga tower. The entire structure of human civilization would just collapse overnight.
This raises an important question. How does the author plan to solve these monumental, foundational issues that arise from this proposed marriage strike?
And this is where the text takes its final, most surprising, and frankly, most manipulative turn.
It is a deliberate cliffhanger. The text doesn't actually provide the answers to those logistical nightmares, at least not within the confines of this specific argument.
It systematically dismantles the pillars of society, lists all the existential threats to human survival that will result from it, and just leaves the reader hanging over the edge.
The author states vaguely that solving these immense problems requires the, quote, ingenuity of civilized people in society. However, it then very conveniently notes that a theoretical system, a master plan to solve all of this, has actually already been prepared.
Prepared by an entity called Life Genuine.
Yes! The text concludes by stating that if one wishes to find the answers to how a society functions peacefully without the family unit, one must seek to understand the values and the theoretical system of Life Genuine.
I have to pause here and point out the absolute rhetorical brilliance and the danger of this structure for you listening. Think about the psychological journey the author has just taken the reader on. It is a textbook masterclass in the problem-reaction-solution paradigm used by radical movements and utopian cults throughout history.
It is a highly engineered method of tearing down an old paradigm to create an absolute psychological necessity for a new one.
Right. They systematically diagnose the most universally accepted human institution, the family, as a lethal virus. They convince the reader that this virus is the hidden cause of all their daily stress, their financial struggles, their emotional torment.
They'll create the void.
Exactly. They propose tearing it down, which strips the reader of their safety net and creates a terrifying void of existential questions about survival. And then, right at the absolute peak of that manufactured uncertainty and vulnerability, they introduce a proprietary, branded worldview as the single, exclusive key to salvation.
It is an incredibly potent piece of persuasion, entirely regardless of whether you agree with the underlying premise about the family.
It really is. So let's briefly recap the intellectual gauntlet we just ran today. We started with the audacious claim that history's greatest spiritual and political figures failed because they treated symptoms instead of the disease.
Then we explored the biological analogy.
Right, the family as an infected cell, functioning as a corrupted operating system that forces us to weaponize our love into societal greed. We unpacked the radical solution of a global marriage strike by attrition. And finally, we ended at the doorstep of the mysterious, proprietary Life Genuine system.
It is a complete and utter deconstruction of the norms we take for granted every single day.
It challenges the very air we breathe. I want to take a second to address you directly, our listener. Thank you. Thank you for your open-mindedness and intellectual curiosity today. Exploring deeply unconventional and structurally challenging source material like this is never easy, but it is exactly how we stretch our understanding of the world.
And as we wrap up this analysis, I want to leave you with one final lingering question to mull over, something that builds on the deep mechanics of the text we discussed today.
Let's hear it.
If the drive to protect, elevate, and relentlessly secure resources for our specific loved ones is exactly what fuels societal inequality, corporate corruption, and the depletion of our shared world, is it possible that humanity's most universally praised selfless instinct, our willingness to sacrifice everything for our family, is simultaneously our most destructive and selfish one?
Wow. That is a remarkably heavy thought to carry into the rest of your week.
Yeah.
It forces you to look at why we do the things we do in a completely different, almost blinding light. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Keep asking hard questions, keep seeking out new perspectives, and we will catch you next time.